Now in this section, we're going to get to more fun stuff, market equilibrium. So we're going to put together the supply and demand curves. And this will create and use a graph to illustrate market equilibrium and what's going on at the market equilibrium. So market equilibrium is a situation in which the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. So that at a given price, all of the buyers who are willing and able to purchase that product are able to buy so. And all of the units being supplied by firms are being purchased. Because this market has many buyers and sellers, we're going to call this a perfectly competitive market. So an equilibrium in a perfectly competitive market is called a competitive market equilibrium. So using the smartwatch example, there are about 25 firms selling smartwatches. So we're going to assume that this is enough to generate competition and get this good competitive behavior between firms in the market for smartwatches. So now let's put together the supply and demand curves that we talked about in the previous two sections. So we have this upward sloping supply, the number of goods that firms are willing and able to supply at a given price, and the market demand, which slopes downward, which is the number of smartwatches that consumers are willing to buy at any given price. So let's say in this case, our equilibrium price is $350. At this price, consumers will be willing and able to buy 5 million smartwatches, and producers will want to sell 5 million smartwatches. So we say that the equilibrium price in this market is $350, and the equilibrium quantity in this market is 5 million smartwatches per week. Now the equilibrium price and quantity is going to be determined by where the supply and demand curves cross. So at that market equilibrium, the price the goods are sold at will be the same, and the quantity the goods that are being sold will be the same. So since buyers and sellers want to trade the same quantity at the price of $350, we don't expect the price to change. So we've reached equilibrium and we'll stay there until one of the factors that shifts supply and demand curves will move those. And we'll talk about that more in the next section. So even though firms will prefer to sell at higher prices, their desire for profits and to stay in business forces them to lower the price at equilibrium. Likewise, consumers would prefer to pay less, but their desire to actually get the goods forces them to pay more and pay the market equilibrium price. Market pressure and these competitive pressures forces the price towards equilibrium. If firms set the price too high, customers don't want to buy, and they're going to have to lower their price to sell them. In real life, the supply and demand curves aren't known, and it's very difficult to try to estimate them. So it can be difficult to determine this price. So firms may set prices too high or too low. But over time, these market pressures are going to force them towards the equilibrium price. So let's look at an example of the invisible hand, as Adam Smith called it, eliminating shortages, moving the market towards equilibrium. So let's say the price in this market is $400. All right, instead of the $350 equilibrium price, firms don't realize that, and they set the price at $400. At this price, consumers will want to buy 4 million smartwatches. But at the price of $400, firms are willing to sell 6 million smartwatches. We end up in this case with a surplus of 2 million smartwatches. A surplus is a situation in which the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. So we have these leftover goods that aren't being sold. So what's going to happen? Sellers are going to compete amongst themselves, driving the price down over time towards equilibrium. They have these unsold goods that are sitting on their shelves. They get expensive to store, and you have to also pay workers to make the goods. So they'll end up having to reduce the price down to $350 to get rid of the excess. Now, what would happen if they set the price at $250? So they set it $100 below the competitive market equilibrium price. Well, at a price of $250, consumers are going to want to buy 7 million smartwatches. But because of the lower price, producers are only able to produce and sell 3 million. In this case, we end up with a shortage of 4 million smartwatches, the difference between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. So a shortage is a situation in which the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, so the opposite problem we had on the previous slide. So what's going to happen? Sellers are going to realize that they can increase the price and still sell just as many smartphones. So what they're going to do is increase the price. Now, as they increase the price that they're selling smartwatches at, they're going to be able to move along the supply curve because now they're getting a higher price back. So they can afford to increase production, or they can buy more resources that could be used elsewhere. Again, as they produce more, their cost of production are going to increase. And this is going to happen. They're going to move along the supply curve and keep increasing their price all the way up until they reach the competitive market equilibrium, that price of $350, in which case they'll go back to selling 5 million smartwatches. And as the price increases, consumer demand is going to fall. So people that are only willing or able to spend $250 on smartwatches, before, when the price was $250, they were willing to buy there. But as the price increases, they're less and less willing and able to buy. So by the time we get back to that price of $350, only 5 million consumers are willing to purchase smartwatches. So again, we've reached market equilibrium. It's important to remember that both supply and demand count in determining the equilibrium price and quantity. Remember, the price is determined by the interaction of buyers and sellers. So in a competitive market, neither of these groups have the sort of power to dictate prices. What's going to end up changing the price and the quantity traded is going to be changes in supply and demand. So if we're shifting either of those curves. This brings us to the final section of this chapter, the effect of demand and supply shifts on equilibrium. So in this section, we'll be using demand and supply graphs to predict changes in prices and quantities. So predictions about price and quantity in our model requires us to know supply and demand curves. Typically, in the real world, we know the price and the quantity, but we don't know the curves that generate them. But don't worry, the power of the demand and supply model is in its ability to predict directional changes in the price of quantity traded. So we may not know the exact curves, which makes it difficult or impossible to estimate what the actual changes in price and quantity are going to be. But while we can't get that perfectly accurate estimation, we can understand if it's going to shift, if a shift in supply or demand is going to increase the price, decrease the price, increase the quantity demanded, decrease the quantity demanded. These will be much easier to show through this model, and that's what the true power of the supply and demand model is. So here we have an example of the effect of an increase in supply on the equilibrium. Now the graph shows the market for smartwatches before Apple enters the market. So the initial price was at P1 and the initial quantity was at Q1. That was the equilibrium price and quantity. So when Apple enters the market, more smartphones are supplied at every given price. So there's an increase in supply, and the curve moves from S1 to S2. Now what this does, the equilibrium price falls from P1 to P2, and the equilibrium quantity rises from Q1 to Q2. So the effect of a shift in supply on the right, so an increase in supply, is that the equilibrium price is going to fall and the equilibrium quantity is going to rise. So by how much is price going to fall and how much is the quantity going to rise? That, unfortunately, we can't give a good answer for without knowing a lot more information. We'd have to know the actual supply and demand curves and know the specific slopes they have, the shape, whether it's a straight line or whether it's a slight curve. So for now, we can only predict that the price and quantity traded, the price will fall and the quantity traded will rise. We can't say specifically how large those increases or decreases are going to be. Now let's explore the effect of an increase in demand on equilibrium. So let's suppose that incomes increase. What's going to happen to the equilibrium in the market for smartwatches? Well, because smartwatches are a normal good, as income rises, the demand is going to shift to the right. So the demand will increase. And we'll move from demand curve D1 to demand curve D2. The equilibrium price is going to increase, so it'll move from P1 to P2, and the equilibrium quantity will rise from Q1 to Q2. So here on this slide we have a table that shows how shifts in demand and supply curves are going to affect the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Now this isn't something you need to memorize or go through. It's much easier, much more intuitive to just work with the supply and demand curves and to, even if you need scratch paper, to draw it out and show a shift in the supply curve or a shift in the demand curve and to see what happens to the equilibrium price and quantity, rather than simply trying to memorize all the different things that could happen. Now let's make a connection to the real world and see an example of this, how changes in supply and demand curves influence the change in equilibrium price and quantity. First, let's look at the price of Blu-ray players. So from 2006 to 2013, the price of Blu-ray players fell from about $800 to about $95, while the number of Blu-ray players traded increased dramatically. So what best explains this change? An increase in demand, a decrease in demand, an increase in supply, or a decrease in supply? Well, let's turn to our supply and demand diagram to help work this out. So here we have a supply and demand curve showing the equilibrium for Blu-ray players. So originally, back in the beginning of our period, the price was about $800. So at $800, the quantity demanded and quantity supplied on the market was 0.425 million Blu-ray players. Now over time, the supply curve shifted out to the right, moving from S1 to S2, leading to an equilibrium price of about $120 and a quantity demanded and sold of 11.25 million Blu-ray players per year. So what we had is an increase in supply as additional firms entered the market and input costs fell. And this is what led to both lower prices and an increase in the quantity traded. Now, over time, it's likely that both demand and supply are going to change. So for example, new firms enter the market for smartwatches and incomes increase. So if these both happen, the supply of smartwatches are going to shift to the right, and the demand for smartwatches are also going to shift to the right. So what does our model predict? Well, an increase in supply is going to decrease the price and increase the quantity. An increase in demand is going to increase the price and increase the quantity. So we can be sure that equilibrium quantity is going to rise in this case, because both shifts in supply and demand are going to cause an increase in the quantity. However, the effect on price is not clear. The shift in supply causes the price to fall. Shift in demand, an increase in demand causes the price to increase. So the effect is going to be ambiguous, and it's going to depend on whether the supply curve shifts more or the demand curve shifts more. So this panel shows the demand curve shifting more than the supply curve. So in this case, the equilibrium price is going to rise, just like the equilibrium quantity. Now the figure in this panel shows supply shifting more than demand. So in this case, the quantity is still going to rise, but the equilibrium price is going to fall. The effect of the increase of supply is larger than the effect of the increase in demand. So without knowing the relative size of these changes, the effect on equilibrium price is ambiguous. So unless we know how much the supply curve is going to shift relative to the demand curve, we're not going to be able to figure out what the effect on price is going to be. And I should note that it is possible, but it's very unlikely, that supply and demand curves will shift the exact right amount so that the equilibrium price remains unchanged. It's a possibility, but very, very rare. Now we can fill in the rest of table 3.3 that I showed a few slides ago. Again, this isn't something you memorize. It's something to either help you study or you can use to check your answers. So when you're practicing and shifting supply and demand curves, you can double check what the effect is going to be using this. Finally, we'll end this section with showing the difference between the shifts in a curve versus movements along a curve. Make sure we have the terminology right. So suppose that there's an increase in supply that occurs. We know the equilibrium price is going to decrease and the equilibrium quantity is going to increase. Now it's tempting to believe that the decrease in price is going to cause an increase in demand. So it'll cause the demand curve to shift in response to this change in price. But this is incorrect. Remember, the decrease in price is not going to cause a movement along the demand curve, not an increase in demand. And a change in price is what causes a movement along the curve rather than one of the variables that actually shifts the curve. So the demand curve already describes how much of the good consumers want to buy at any given price. So a change in the price isn't going to be something that shifts that curve. Remember that. So when the price change occurs, we just look at the demand curve to see what happens to how much consumers want to buy. So say, in this case, we shift the supply curve. We're going to move along the supply curve from the initial equilibrium point where those two curves cross to the new equilibrium point where the new supply curve crosses the demand curve. So we'll move along the curve rather than causing another shift in the demand curve.